afternoon session. My name is James Heft. I'm the president of a research institute at the University of Southern California called the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies, and I'm also part of the faculty. I think one of the reasons I may be chairing this panel is because I have been leading a seminar for a couple of years on the subject of religion and violence, which has been a rather fascinating experience. The other reason is because I'm German and I keep things in order. So I'll tell you what I told the panel before we started, and that is that at 14 minutes, I will say you have 1 minute left, and at 15, I will demand that they stop or I will turn off the microphone. That will ensure that we will have time for discussion. Let me introduce each person when that person speaks. I'm going to start with Bob Roberts. What's fascinating, I think, about this panel is we have people from three distinct religious traditions, out of the evangelical Christian tradition, out of the Jewish tradition, out of the Mormon tradition. So it'll be rather interesting to see the focus being public diplomacy. That's the subject. So what's the public diplomacy that a particular religious tradition can deliver, and how can that be done? Bob Roberts is a graduate of Baylor, Southwestern Seminary, and Fuller Seminary right up the road. He's been extremely active in planting churches, but also working with people of other religious traditions in other parts of the world. And it's from that extensive experience that he will speak. Bob.
Let me make it very clear. I am not an academic, and I am not a diplomat. So I'm going to speak to you more from the vantage point of a pastor and an activist. This is not the kinds of things that I do are definitely not something I planned on, I expected, even dreamed about doing or thought about doing, let alone had any interest in doing. The short version is our church wanted to work somewhere in the world, and so we wanted to pick a spot that we could make a difference. Through a long set of circumstances, we wound up adopting the city of Hanoi, Vietnam. It's not the kind of place that a lot of Christians go and do Christian mission work. To make a long story short, what happened was we had a man who was a doctor who came to our church, and he told me, he said, "Bob, I can go anywhere in the world and do anything." And so I said, all right, let's try it. So we literally got on a plane, went to Hanoi, Vietnam, and we began to work in a hospital and do some humanitarian work. From there, we had some exchange students come to our church. The Vietnamese passed a law and so forth. So most of these kids were high government officials, kids and so forth. One of the kids' father wanted to meet me for various reasons. And when I met them, they had never met a Christian. And so their first question to me was, well, why do you even believe that there's a God? Through which I went through philosophical apologetics, and I began to explain that in a very slow and simple way because I slept through a good bit of that course, I'm sorry to say. I'm like I said, I'm evangelical. So anyhow, I'm just teasing kind of. So anyhow, the man told me, he said, "I've never heard this before. Would you come back and sit down and visit with us?" So I said, sure. So what I didn't realize, I was visiting with government ministers and a lot of other people that were fairly significant in the government. And they said, "Would you bring some Bibles and come back and start visiting with us?" I said, "Well, I can't do that." And the man said, "Why?" And I said, "Because the government won't let me bring Bibles in." And he laughed at me and he said, "We are the government." And they really were. And those men became my friends. We've had something like 75 exchange students from Hanoi over the past 10 years. And what happened was we began to realize that we could do a whole lot in Vietnam. If we wanted to preach, start churches, that was out. But if we wanted to serve people through the jobs of our church members, be they doctors, educators, so forth, didn't matter. And so every year we have a few hundred people from our church that are constantly going back and forth, from helping to start businesses to digging water wells to microfinance. Take your pick. Whatever your job is, that's what our church does there. The second thing that happened, I'm telling you two stories fast so you can get an understanding of where I'm coming from. Some people asked me if I would be willing to do the exact same thing in Afghanistan, specifically in Kandahar. And they were friends of mine that were also evangelicals. And I told them, I said, I'm open to that, but I want you to understand we're not going underground. We're not going to start churches. We're not going to do all this religious stuff. If people ask us about our faith, that's fine. But beyond that, we're going to go there and serve the city. And so I grew out my beard, and me and three guys crossed the Afghan desert with some Pakistani mercenaries. And we went to the governor's house and knocked on the door. And I told him, I said, my name is Bob Roberts. I'm from America, and I'm a pastor. In any way that we can serve the city of Kandahar, we want to be able to help you out. And so he gave me a long list. And one of the things that he wanted was a children's hospital, for which I came back and called every Episcopalian and Presbyterian that I knew. Raised about $10 million. We went back. We got that project going. And at the end of the day, I'm sitting there with this particular man, and he's talking to me about what I like to do, and I told him I love to hike. And his father is one of the top tribal leaders in the whole country. And he said, well, come on, and I will show you Afghanistan, places you can hike like nowhere else. And I leaned over beside me, the guy that was with me who lived in the country. I said, is it safe? He said, Bob, you're in Afghanistan. Nothing's safe. He said, but if you want to go, this man can probably protect you. So I got into his SUV with a machine gunner on one side, him in the front, a rocket launcher in the back. I'm from Texas. We love our guns. I discovered camel hunting with rocket launchers. It's a wonderful experience. But no, I'm teasing. But anyhow, we wound up going out into the desert. And because I'm from Texas, they, I guess, had seen a Western, thought I could ride a camel, which I couldn't. Then he wound up taking me to the village he grew up in. And he said they need a school. He didn't need my money. He's got money. But we volunteered to build a school. It was just $10,000. So we built the school. And so I began to ask him, Umar, do you understand what I do? And so forth. And he knew a little bit. And I asked him, I said, do you understand what a Christian pastor is? He didn't. And I said, imam. I'm like a Christian imam. And he said, oh, this is wonderful. So he got on his satellite phone. I didn't know what he was doing. I was just praying hard. And we went to this compound and ate supper, got through, 9 or 10 at night. And in comes these 15 young men with one old man. And they're all young imams. And he said, this is an American, this is a Christian, and he is a pastor. And you can ask him whatever you want. And so he acted as my translator. And so we talked all the kind of religious things that you diplomats might be bored about. But that's what we did. We talked late into the night about that. And then Umar began to brag about me building a school for his village, to which they all wanted a school built, representing 4 villages. Now, you've got to understand, I'm from Deep East Texas. I am an evangelical, and I'm very passionate about what I believe. And I want the whole world to at least hear about Jesus. I don't want to force anyone. I don't want to coerce anyone, but I want people to at least have the option of hearing. And so these are Muslims. They're the opposite religion. You know, they have the dawah. I have the Great Commission. What do I do with that? And so in the context of that, what I did was I said, well, I'll tell you what. And this is serious. I was really praying hard. I said, God, this is a stretch for me. I don't know if this is right or not. Billy Graham wasn't there for me to consult with. So I said, I'll tell you what. We'll build 4 schools. You read the New Testament. And I didn't even think if the New Testament was in their language at that time. But you read the New Testament, we'll read the Quran, and 25% of the students have to be girls. And that started everything. And I could talk more about it and what we did. But what happened there was, in Vietnam, it was about relating to a different government, a communist government. But in Afghanistan, what it was for me was about learning to relate to people of other faith. And that was huge for me. Well, you know, the big thing for evangelicals is our view of the second coming of Christ and our views of Israel and so forth. And I began to realize as I began to become friends with a lot of Muslims that, frankly, my theology that I grew up with and my understanding of how Christ comes back was actually getting in a direct command of Jesus Christ that we've been given as Christians to serve people, love them, and make sure his name is known and not pit one against the other. So those 2 experiences were incredibly formative. And I think, you know, I could tell you more, but that wound up opening doors to things that I do with the UN and around the world. And so I didn't understand all that was taking place, but what it was public diplomacy. And, you know, people ask me all the time, why in the world do the Vietnamese work with you? And for a long time, I didn't understand why, but then I did come to understand. It's very simple. They're concerned about how Americans think of Vietnam. And American evangelicals have a huge amount to do with the perception of Vietnam and, you know, religious persecution. So I'm going to give these very quick, and I promise you I'll stop on time. I don't like long-winded preachers. Here are my 6 points. Number 1, we've got to create a new platform to have a conversation on around the world, and I call it multi-faith. Don't be offended. I'm probably the only evangelical in this room. And for the most part, most of you guys are mainline and so forth. The reality is the real conflict in the world is not between liberals, as you heard Reza say, and moderates and mainliners. It's between conservative fundamentalists that are Muslims and Christians, of which, as a Christian, you could put me into that category. So the question becomes, you're not going to enlighten us where we compromise our convictions about the Bible or the Word of God or who we believe Jesus is. The question then becomes, if we're not going to kill one another, how do we get together and have a conversation where we can at least do what Doug said this morning and treat one another with respect? I call that multi-faith. Interfaith, to me, is this thing that says all roads lead to heaven. I've got to compromise what I believe in order to get along with someone else, which means I have to shift my views of God. For somebody who's very passionate about their faith and is very authority-oriented in terms of their religious literature, be it the Quran or be it the Bible, we're not going to shift what we believe truth is based on popular public opinion and how people get along, for good or bad. So the result of that is we have to have a new platform. It's multi-faith. So this time last year, one of the things we did, the largest synagogue, the largest mosque, and our church all came together. And we had a weekend pilgrimage. Friday, we all went to the synagogue, had kosher dessert, and watched their service. And then the imam, the rabbi, and I did a Q&A. Saturday, we all went to the mosque. Sunday, they all came to our church. It was incredible. I've never preached to people with hijabs and caps and everything else, but it was incredible for our church members. It led to cooking classes, home build-overs, tons and tons of other things that are going right now. I'm taking the imam turkey hunting in 2 weeks, and he's from Pakistan and grew up in London a good bit. And I told him, I want to take you to East Texas hunting, but you can't wear the cap, the shirt, none of that stuff. You run through the woods looking like that in East Texas, you'll get us both shot. You're going to wear a T-shirt, you're going to wear jeans, and you're going to speak with a Mexican accent. If you do that, we're fine. And he said, I'm fine. So he's taken his son and a couple of kids from his youth group. So anyhow, we're going to pray nobody gets hurt. So number one, we have to create a new platform, which is multi-faith. Number two, we have to open the congregations. Here's the value of religious leaders. It's not the religious leaders. It's what they have access to. It's the people in their mosques, their churches, and their synagogues. The problem is, to get to those people, you got to go through the imams, the pastors, and the rabbis. That's a big problem. People in our congregations are far more open to building relationships than we are. Our church gives somewhat of a free hand at that. But every time those women get together, I'm not going to say which other faiths, but they're always having to check with their religious leaders because there's a concern. Oh no, is this going to go too far or something like that? So the value of the religious is to open the congregation. Third, you're going to touch the sword. In other words, you start with the hand. As a diplomat, I understand what you have to do. As an academic, you start with the head. That's really not the way the world works. You start with the hand, Jonathan Sachs, if you will, the home we build together. What's a common issue we've all got to address? You work together, you start liking one another, you start laughing with one another, then you're ready to talk about faith. When you do that, you can do everything. I'm in and out of Gaza, funded by Muslims, taken in by British diplomats, with evangelical doctors doing humanitarian work. It's a lot of fun. We stay in the home of the foreign minister. I tell stories about Jesus at night. They tell me stories about Muhammad and the Quran. But it all started with, what is the need and how do we do that? Fourth, this is critical. You have to challenge your own tribe more than any other tribe. Challenge your own tribe. That's just huge. I discovered, I was afraid of communists, then I was afraid of Muslims, and then I came to learn both of those. I discovered my own tribe is more frightening to me than communists and Muslims today. And the truth of the matter is, there's a book called Crossing the Divide. It was from a Harvard symposium I read. The challenge is to stay within your tribe. You have to have credibility and validity in your tribe, but you have to challenge your tribe. We took hits when we did the multi-faith thing. We did a thing called the Global Faith Forum, globalfaithforum.org. You can go see it. I had Muslims, Jews, everything was at our church. The Vietnamese ambassador, Turki Al-Faisal from Saudi Arabia. They all came and they spoke. I figured everybody would be excited about it. Not everybody in my tribe. And so the biggest price you're going to pay is with your own tribe. I wrote editorials that were in the Washington Post for the Mosque 51. And not because I want a mosque, but because I believe in religious freedom. And I also believe that if I want religious freedom around the world as an evangelical, then I've got to practice that at home where it hurts the most. And I could talk to you about other things I'm involved in, but I'm challenging my own tribe when I do that. When I write those articles, I'm really writing them to my tribe. And so there's a challenge. Next, you have to listen to their stories and create a common narrative. That's huge, and that's what our multi-faith forum did. And then finally, from serving to convert, from serving because we've been converted. Here's the thing. If you're a Muslim, if you're a Jew, if you're a Christian and you're orthodox in your belief, here's what we all believe. Number one, there is God. Number two, only God does the saving. You really can't save anyone anyhow. I don't care how fundamentalist you are in your faith. I don't care how conservative you are. So the reality is the greatest thing that we can do is to be more converted by our own faith so that we're serving people in the nature of, for me, Christ. And that's the different directions of diplomacy, to governments, to faiths, to tribes.
1 minute.
That's it.
I yield the rest of his time to myself. Thank you. Excellent.
You bet.
That's great.
Randall Paul graduated from Brigham Young with a BS in social psychology in 1970. Got an MBA from Harvard in 1972 and a PhD at the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. He's been involved in this kind of interfaith, if that's not the wrong word.
Multi-faith.
Multi-faith. I hear you. Work for a full 15, 20 years now. Randall?
Thank you. I'm going to pretend I'm an academic for just a few minutes and then dig into more your style, I hope. But I'm a social conflict theorist, for those of you who do come from an academic background. And since I was introduced as a Mormon, I will give you a kind of a quick, call it an intellectual autobiography or genealogy on how I think. Those of you who have read these authors will get me, and you can leave. I went to the University of Chicago, great books program, so I'm going to just name the authors that have most influenced what I'm about to say. Heraclitus, Moses, Matthew and Mark, Muhammad, John Milton, Roger Williams, for whom I'll stand for this one. He'll be very important. John Madison, Joseph Smith Jr., Georg Simmel, William James, Emmanuel Levinas, Viktor Frankl, David Tracy, Martin Marty, Harold Bloom, John Gottman, the famous marriage therapist, and Krister Stendhal. May he rest in peace. He died a couple of years ago. Those of you who know, there is a common thread to all these authors, and that is that they looked at conflict as a given all the way down and all the way up. And their writings were very nuanced, as we say, when it comes to conflict. They understood that, as Simmel would say, conflict brings people together as well as creates a dissociation. So it's an association and a dissociation. And if you take anything from what I'm saying theoretically today, we are trying to, in our foundation for religious diplomacy, create a new way of thinking about religious conflict that is constructive and proactively useful in the world. Lincoln said, at a time of great crisis, he said that the times are piled high with difficulty, and if we don't think anew, we will not be able to disenthrall ourselves and save our country. Disenthrall it was a pun there, that term we don't use very often, but it means to unenslave ourselves. And it's in our thinking that we often find ourselves enslaved, not with evil thoughts, but just the thoughts that are worn out, that require new thinking given new times. I think he would have said, instead of our country today, he would have said, only by thinking anew can we save our world today. That's part of the thinking, of the archaism that we hear at the end of all of our American speeches, God bless America. Most people go, that's not bad, but not quite inclusive enough anymore. You know, we need blessings. I mean, I'm invested in stocks in Europe. I want God to bless Europe too. And so, you know, there's this idea that is definitely moving beyond saving our country. And it's not just an environmental, all breathing the same air. That's part of it. But so how do we think anew? One of the ways we think anew is to think about what it means to be saved and how people in the world see the end coming. If there scientists, they see the end coming in about 1 billion years, right? It's over in about 1 billion years. There's no way out of it. If you're a scientist, this thing's going to all blow up, all right? So the question between a scientist and an evangelical eschatologist is just a matter of time, really. I mean, ultimately, there is the question of what's your end game? What do you think is going to happen? Is it going to be violent? Are humans going to cause it? Is God going to come in and end the game? We found in interreligious thought and in dialogue over public policy, this is a profoundly important question to think about how people anticipate the end coming and how soon it will come, and whether or not God is going to do it or whether humans are going to do it, whether it's inevitable or not inevitable to be a violent end. And I'd like you to all think about this yourselves. It's always a provocative thought to think yourself about whether you think it's just, we're basically playing a game where we're all going to lose in the long run, or whether there is some way of making a difference in the long run. That's an important beginning point, I think, in religious thought. Another way of thinking anew we have found is to ask, what is peace? Most of us are here today, and we'd probably say, well, the reason you're interested in public diplomacy is peace. I mean, that's what it's all about, right? Peace. And a way of thinking anew we have found is to follow Viktor Frankl's thought. He said it's a mistaken idea that homeostasis or calmness or tranquility is peace. Human beings only find peace when they're struggling for a purpose bigger than themselves. That's when they find peace. It's in the act of struggle. That's a very interesting and deep thought that our foundation affirms completely, that peace is the wrong goal. That is a goal that is not a human goal. We say peaceful tension is the goal. That's as close as we can get to it, a peaceful tension, a struggle. Jihad, where is he? We need him here. A jihad is for the right purpose, in the right manner, is peace. And that's an interesting thing because it's tied often with truth and justice. I'll say that Roger Williams wrote a famous book. He was the founder of religious liberty in America. And he had in this book the friendship, the tense friendship between peace and truth. They're rarely compatible, he said. Anyone who affirms truth has a hard time with peace. He said at the end of his book, what we need to do is introduce peace and truth to patience. And what you might call, if I had a title of this little spiel today, it would be vigorous patience. Engaged, vigorous patience that includes the engagement in a contest over truth. Where we err, I think, and where we need to think anew is in the way we think about our public policy goals. We usually start with murder being pretty bad, war being a little bit better. Then we have persecution. Then we have tolerance. And then we have what? What's better than tolerance? Yes, I have a student in the audience just gave the right answer. Yes.
Which was the right answer?
Which was respect, or what we call in our group engaged cooperation and co-resistance. That is a form of engagement, brings you into the presence of the other person, showing you care about the other person. Cooperation shows that you listen and take that person into account, and where you can, you cooperate. Co-resistance shows that you are in the jihad over truth as you see it. You're living with integrity. You have to say, no, not that. I would be phony to you and not authentic with you if I just said everything's cool here because we eat, sleep, and drink and are commonly human. What I really worry about is whether or not you're going to hell. And so I've got to tell you honestly, that's where it is. And I understand, hearing from you, that you have similar concerns about me in another direction, that I'm not going to be enlightened. Okay? So after you have that respectful or honorable engagement, for which we don't have a really good word because respect tends to be a little bit passive. We're looking for a stronger word. Then you have the possibility of actually partnership, deep partnership, or in some cases membership in an organization. And finally, you've got deep friendship and even deep loving relationships of marriage and things like that in our social relationships. So, and that care brings us to what you were talking about, I think, profoundly, and what we've heard all along as a subtle message today. It's mutuality. I never would have thought, and I don't think anybody would think, that in the 21st century, the most profoundly important cross-disciplinary way of looking at the world would be missiology. But I think that's what we're coming to. A missiology that is mutual, where we study how to be rhetorically and persuasively influential on each other in a mutual fashion. The vision for the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy eventually is to have a school for missionaries of all sorts, where they learn together how to convert each other. The idea would be to maximize the excellence of all religious ways. Both in the Proverbs it says, "Steel sharpens steel like friends do." Only, the idea of friendship is steel sharpening steel. The Quran is full of some wonderful scriptures that can teach all other religions things. We've already heard the one today, 548, that was quoted in the table, that if God had wanted to make us all one, he would have done so, but otherwise he's made us so that we can compete or vie with each other in righteousness. And then in the sweet by and by, Roger Williams' patience, all will be known at the end. God will, and if your eschatology allows for a God, will make things clear in the end. This, along with the Tower of Babel story, is a powerful story in both Hebrew texts and in Christian. I think Christians would buy this too. Most people think the Tower of Babel story is a story that is a punishment of God on humanity for its hubris. I see it as a programmatic way of enhancing the real reason for the world. Men thought if they could all only have one religion and one language and a good economy and good technology, they could build themselves a tower and have heaven on earth, right? That's all we want. We want to have everybody, no poor among us, great technology, everybody's educated, we all have one language and all have one religion and everything's cool, right? Well, apparently God had other things in mind and split the languages of the world up in this story, creating the very diversity that we see around us. And I think we might think anew by saying, well, what is the benefit of diversity? Do we just celebrate it? That's not working. There's got to be another reason, deeper reason, for mere multiplicity. And I would submit that in religious to religious conflict, if we engage it with the kind of patient care that can happen, as we've seen happen, and some of the things that Doug talked to us about earlier this morning, for example, we find a way of loving people in a way that we never could believe we would. We go back and retrieve Jesus, hey, if it's easy to love your neighbor, if your neighbor's, a Republican, or, it's easy to love your kids. Even the sinners do that. But this outrageous love your enemy business, even Christians look at that and they go, well, that's an interesting one. We'll just leave that until some other time.
1 minute left.
Yeah, we'll leave it for 1 minute. But I think I'd like to finish the idea here is we need to retrieve the lively experiment of Roger Williams, in which he can be a model for the 21st century. He was a religious fanatic a missionary par excellence, who would go, however, and die for his opponent's freedom to argue with him, to say he was wrong. It is that mutuality and openness to the opponent that we need to retrieve in our discourse today. And it is deeply important. We see it's terrible. Our public discourse, when it comes to politics, we sense these people aren't really talking with each other. The same happens in religion. So let's try to be mutual. Let's fight fair. Let's fight with honor, and let's never fight with coercion, but only with loving persuasion.
Thank you. Our final panelist, Janice Kamenir-Reznik, is co-founder and president of the Jewish World Watch, an organization established in 2004 to mobilize the community against global human rights abuses and genocide in general, and the genocide in Darfur in particular. For more than 2 decades prior to starting Jewish World Watch, Janice practiced law as a partner with the firm in Resnick and Resnick, and then at Jeffer, Mangels, Butler, and Marmero. Most recently, she has been involved very much in trying to fight the genocide in Darfur, as well as the crisis in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where she's trying to help address the massive gang rapes of women of Eastern Congo. Janice.
Thank you. Like Pastor Bob, I am not an academic. I am not a theorist. I'm not a rabbi. I am what classically would be just called a community organizer and an activist. And it's from that perspective that I speak today. Let me give you a drop of context about the organization that Rabbi Schulweis and I co-founded in 2004. Rabbi Schulweis is a man of 87 years old. His entire rabbinate was basically in the post-Holocaust era of the development of American Jewish community. He is considered one of the great progressive Jewish thinkers of our time. And he's a person who believes as much in the duty to disobey as he believes in the duty to obey. And that's actually the title of his last book. But he called me one day 7 years ago, and he said, "What did you do about Rwanda?" He said, "You come to temple every Saturday morning. You read the Torah every week. You talk about not standing idly by. What do you do about Rwanda?" And I said, "Where are you coming from? What is this all about?" And he says, "Well, don't get too defensive. I didn't do anything about it either." And he says, "And what about Cambodia? And what about all of the other 37 genocides that have happened since the Holocaust?" And I asked him if I could call him back in about a half an hour so I can go figure out where Darfur is. I had no idea at the time, and 100,000 people had already been murdered. I had no idea where it was or what it was. After I Googled and did a little bit of very perfunctory research, I called him back and said, "You're right. Okay, what are we going to do?" And he said, "I've spent the last 60 years of my rabbinate asking where the people of faith and the people of conscience were when Jews were being murdered, and 1/3 of our people, almost 1/2 of our people, were decimated." He says, "Now I look at myself and I said, what have I done when millions and millions of people have been murdered and killed and destroyed in similar ways?" And so I said, "Okay, that's it. Nothing else need be said. Let's mobilize. Let's get the community. Let's awaken the conscience of the community about genocide and about mass atrocities." And within a very short time, we had almost 70 synagogues in this city, all of whom operate at losses and in the red, like most nonprofits these days, all of whom were actually paying $1 per family unit member to join an organization which was going to be dedicated to a 3-pronged mission of educating people about genocide, those that have happened in the past, those that are happening now, and being able to be aware of those that might be happening in the future. We were going to activate the community to help pass legislation where appropriate. And we are going to also, because we know so well about the pain and suffering of people who've been victimized in that way, we are going to provide relief projects that would be responsive to whatever the sufferings were that were happening, and also economic development projects to help rebuild the people who had been affected and who had survived the genocide. Since then, we've raised about $12 to $15 million. We have about 35 or 40 on-the-ground projects in Darfur and then expanding into Congo. We have the largest solar cooker project in the world operating in 4 refugee camps. It was a rape prevention project to be able to allay the issues when women and girls have to go out looking for firewood, which doesn't exist, but for very long treks out into the desert, where it's more and more difficult to find wood because of the drought and because of the total lack of resources in that area of Chad at the border with Darfur. We actually were able to bring about a 90% reduction in these trips outside of the camp by bringing solar cooking into the camp, and we did it with the women's engagement and involvement, which meant going into the camps, which I've done, and going and working with the government there, with the government of the refugee camps, with the nonprofit organizations that are involved there, and with the government of some of the countries, not with the Sudanese government because that's impossible, but we worked with the Chadian government to be able to create our projects to allow all of our materials to come in and to be able to work with the people in their camps. So in a way, I never really thought of it as diplomacy until this conference sort of enlightened me about what it really means to be a diplomat. And I never really even thought about what the word diplomacy means until I thought about this conference. And I do believe, very much like you do believe, that diplomacy is sort of a struggle, the struggle for peacefulness, the struggle to be able to create a world that we can all believe finds favor in God's eyes and be able to meet the needs of all of the people who are on the planet. And the interesting thing about that definition of diplomacy, it's very consistent with my definition of Judaism. Judaism, the story of the Jewish people, is a very activist story. It's a story of struggles and fighting and killing. And when you read the Old Testament, it has very little peacefulness, what one would call peacefulness in that book. And so it's about that struggle to humanize ourselves, to awaken our conscience. It's about the struggle to overcome selfishness. It's about all of those, what I guess you would call natural inclinations, which are not always good inclinations. There is the evil inclination. It's recognized in the biblical, in the liturgy and in the text. So it's diplomacy in many ways is very much like the struggle to be a religious person, to be a person of conscience. It's about bringing that conscience to the world. So I do see a huge alliance between those two ideas of religion and diplomacy. One of the most interesting movements that I was involved in that really underscores the role of religion and diplomacy is actually a movement from many years ago in my very young years when I was actually a social worker and a community organizer before I went to law school. And I worked in the Soviet Jewry movement in the very early 1970s. And that movement was an effort to be able to liberate. It was a Jewish movement, very much inspired by the fact that there was communist oppression against being able to express yourself religiously, and a huge percentage of post-Holocaust Jewry lived in Russia. 1/3 of the Jewish people lived in Russia after the Holocaust. A lot of Eastern European Jewry that actually were able to avoid being murdered by Hitler ended up in Russia. So you have this huge repository of a very large portion of the global Jewish community living without any religion, meaning that they would never really be able to realize their Jewish identities. So I was involved in the early stages in that movement, which began in 1967 and basically ended in the late 1980s, early 1990s, in which ultimately 2 million Russian Jews ended up leaving the former Soviet Union and either going to Israel, the United States, and some smaller amount to Europe. But what was so interesting about that movement is it really was a movement of lay people like me who decided to go into the Soviet Union with books, with materials, totally against the law, and be willing, with KGB following us all over Russia, to be willing to go meet with small groups of people in their apartments and talk about Judaism and talk about what it means and educating people from the ground up, and also being willing to unfurl activist banners when the Russians came to town. There were all the basic Saul Alinsky community organizing strategies that were used by people, they weren't by governments, to be able to get the attention of the American government so that in its trade deals, at the time there were wheat deals, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, and whatnot, that was all provoked by a group of activists, people. And it was not some big, governmental plan to be able to conquer communism through awakening Jewish consciousness. It wasn't anything like that. It was just a ground-up movement. And I think it's a really great example of how activism, which I really believe is an integral part of Judaism and of religion in general. To me, that's one of the purposes of religion, is to change things and to get people to act differently and to take steps that you wouldn't ordinarily take if you were left to your own sort of animalistic or instinctive devices. So I think the Soviet Jewry movement is a great example of religion and public diplomacy. It was a very successful movement, and it wasn't alone in doing that. There was a whole human rights movement with Alexander Solzhenitsyn and others that I don't know what the role of any other religious groups were, but I know about the one that I was involved in the Jewish. It was a huge, huge movement for the Jewish people. And
1 minute.
Today, 1 minute. So the last thing I'll say is this. I see Judaism and religion as playing these four roles: combating indifference, seeing every human being as they were created in the image of God, awakening conscience, and the word prayer in Hebrew, one of the words is avodah, which is the same as the word for service. So service to God is not only through prayer, in my estimation, and in the estimation of most Jews, but it's actually the notion of that Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of the greatest rabbinic thinkers of the 20th century, said it's about praying with your feet. And I think praying with your feet creates activism, which changes public policy, which can actually change the world. And I saw it in the people I met with when I was in Darfur. I see it with the women I work with in Congo. I was also asked a question, just like Bob was asked, who are you? These people, in the black African Muslims that we met with in the refugee camps, absolutely did not know what a Jew was. And I had to figure out how to explain who we were. And I said, we are like you, from an ancient tribe. And an ancient tribe that believes in the four things that I just said. And with that, we really understood each other. And we changed the nature of their life and mine.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the panelists for keeping within the time limit. I have perhaps the privilege of asking the first question, or at least making an observation and then posing a question, and it's this. I was struck how, Janice, you began by describing all of the involvements and the work, and then worked your way back to the religious roots for the motivation of that. And I think you, in doing that, created an interesting link between religion and public diplomacy, and I appreciate that. I'd ask both Randall and Bob this question, and both of them recommended strongly respect for the other as other, respectful, honorable engagement, a kind of revolution in missiology, which is the mission to go out and to convert. Both claim very clearly that, as committed in their religious traditions, the bottom line is, in fact, to get people to understand what that religious tradition is. Question of salvation is involved. So one of the questions I have is the new missiology a more sophisticated strategy for conversion?
You want to take it? You want me to take that shot?
You go.
Okay. We all have many motives, and what we do in our dialogues, to answer your I am going to answer your question briefly, and to say yes and no. Most people of all religions, including non-theistic religions, believe that the conversion experience is somehow internal, and if there's a God, it's between that person and the God. And so the new missiology, to use one of my evangelical friends, Terry Muck's line, is what he calls giftive missiology. You're there to present a gift. In the ancient world, there are always strings attached to the gift, and we can't get around that problem. Either you give a gift or you don't give a gift. What are the strings attached to the gift? Well, some kind of response back. It doesn't say you're forcing a response, but there's an implied response of some sort. Maybe it's, hell no, I won't go, but it's a response. And the other aspect of the new missiology, and this is crucial, this is very new, it's mutual missiology. All religion going forward, we think, that's going to be powerful in the next century will be a religious experience in which it's missionary to missionary contact. And there's parity between the two. And there are all sorts of cultural and social issues of power that are involved here that have to be weighed into this. But for every half hour you spend telling me about Jesus, as you learned from your experience, you spend at least a half hour learning about the Prophet Muhammad. And that's the aspect of this mutuality creates a new way of missiology. And this is also for atheistic thinkers who want to influence the world against religion. They are brought into the missiology circle. They say, religion's screwing up the world. We say, fine, we'll give you your half hour. Come and convince us to be atheists. You're at the table. We want you here. We care about you. We know you care about us. So that's the aspect of the new missiology.
I would like to say that I would love the thought that evangelicals had a new missiology. We don't. We're stuck in 1792 with a man named William Carey, who was great for 1792. For me, the bottom line really is not conversion. For me, the bottom line is obedience to God. If you heard me, that's a huge statement. It was controversial at our church, but the whole concept of we serve because we're converted, not to convert. That's a big difference. So do I want people to get to hear the message? You bet. But here's how I want to get to hear the message. I'm in Syria. I'm speaking at a forum. We're doing some projects there. And an imam and an engineer, we're together and they're praying. And I said, do you care if I pray with you guys? I'm, an evangelical. I'm going to be praying to Jesus. He said, no, pray, man. So we got through prayer. So, I tried to, it's like a Catholic service. I tried to keep up with the bows and so forth, but I did okay. And I got through. And the imam came over to me, and I'd spent a week with him, and he said, I cannot bear the thought of not being in heaven with you. He said, would you let me explain to you what it means to be a Muslim? That man was paying me the greatest compliment he could.
Amen.
He was saying, you know what? I care about you. You're my friend. And I told him, I called him my name, and I said, I feel the same way. We got a real problem here, but let's keep working on it. And in the meantime,
you're my man.
So I think, here's the thing. Everything is connected. All religions are all places. We don't have a context to speak to one another. That's the problem we've got. So we think interfaith. It's not. I mean, I was in Doha last week with Philip Sieb, and I came back with a flag. Some of the Libyan guys gave me, and they're talking about everything from religious freedom to human rights. And I just think it's a new world, and we've got to learn how to hold our faith, all of us, but share it in respectful manners.
We have no religious authority. Judaism is not that type of religion, so it's not that relevant of a question. I think it's probably more relevant to some of the more centralized religions.
I would say for us that it's about globalization. You said it. And so because of that, faith is now outside the parameters of tribes and nations. It's now transglobal. Every religion is everywhere. It goes back to the young man's question he was asking earlier. So I think you're going to see not just a, quote, reformation of Islam. Believe it or not, Christianity, I'm convinced, is on the front end of a major reformation that's going to be driven by the East. And with the emergence of the global church and the explosion, it's inconceivable in my mind that we can have the emergence of Twitter and Facebook, Gutenberg Press, road systems, airplanes, and people from all over the world are going to come to know Christ and think of it in different ways, and we're not going to be affected by that. So I think we're in a major transition. One thing I would say I noticed in Doha is very fascinating to me. Think about it. The reason we started all this faith and diplomacy stuff, please don't be offended if you're Muslim, but it was because of the Islamic challenges in the Middle East that began to happen about 30 years ago. But as I listened to the older Muslims in Doha and the young Muslims in their 20s, those were two radically different conversations that I heard. Mm-hmm. And I'm excited about what I'm hearing from these young Muslims. And so, frankly, even this conversation about how to engage religious actors, we're doing it from the vantage point of what? Afghanistan and difficult Middle Eastern places. I'm excited about what I see coming up the pike and how that's going to impact us. So, and they're not looking to their religious authority like that. I mean, one young lady said something brilliant. I don't know if you got to hear it or not, Phil, but she stood up and she said, we've had dictators, and we don't want an imam for a dictator. She made it very clear. She said, we're not Islamists. She said, the greatest challenge we have is the dictator that lives inside of all of our hearts. Man, I was ready to preach a sermon. It was good.
I'd like to make a couple of quick comments. First of all, our foundation was originally named Foundation for Interreligious Diplomacy. This last year we changed it to Foundation for Religious Diplomacy because we found in trying to create relations for interreligious diplomacy, the intra-religious problems and conflicts always preceded any inter-religious work. The intra is actually the more exciting and interesting activity going on all over the world. Peter Berger wrote the book 20 years ago called The Heretical Imperative. I recommend it to you all. It's a great piece of work showing that human beings, as soon as they come together with an orthodoxy, they start saying, well, you're not quite orthodox, and you're not quite. I mean, it just happens time and time again. We refine each other from the inside, and sometimes that can work. And the other point I want to make on authority itself, Hannah Arendt said that authority does not come from the top down. Authority always is granted by those who are led by the authority. And I'm not talking democracy, she's talking anthropology. And it's an important idea. It's important to think of authority being vested by those who follow. You can civilly disobey. You can go to the death. You can do it. In other words, it's up to you to decide whether you're going to follow an authority. And what we see in these heretical cases is challenges of either the text, the ancient text. I'd argue with you about authority question, actually.
That's our authority.
Yeah,
text.
that's what I'm saying, the text.
Right.
You're challenging the text.
Not a person.
Right. But that is powerful because there are interpreters of that text that gain more or less influence. So that's always a flowing thing of authority. And our religion, we have a single prophet that leads with 12 apostles. But there's also the idea in Mormonism, common consent. So you can hear from God, but you have to say, yes, you'll follow. Like, what was it? Was it Samuel that said to Israel after they wanted a king 3 times, oh, heck, God told him, if Israel wants a king, give him a king. So, there's this idea that God can be negotiable.
Yeah, I like the one where he said, speak, Lord, and your servant will think it over. I belong to perhaps the most centralized religious authority in a world religion. I often say that one of the great things about the Catholic Church is central authority, Vatican II. One of the great problems of the Catholic Church is central authority.
Amen.
I think, as brought out beautifully in the question, in terms of modernity, you have to distinguish more and more between de facto and de jure authority. A teacher goes into classroom with de jure authority, should have authority. De facto, the teacher may have no authority, maybe a lousy teacher, and the kids are wild. So today, I would say one of the things that's happening more and more is that if the person doesn't have a certain authenticity, and that's going to be vetted by a lot of multiple audiences, they're not going to persuade anyone.
Amen.
They have to have a certain authenticity. And for that to be identified as part of the tradition is going to be an ongoing debate within a tradition. But the traditions can shift, as Bob was saying very profoundly. We have time for one more question, and I think that gentleman over there has it.
Thank you very much. I am part of the, as a matter of fact, I serve as Consul General for Belize, and I'm joined by my 2 task force members. Belize has been involved in a territorial conflict with Guatemala going at least 100 years. But I don't know if our government has in fact ever approached the religious groups in Belize in terms of saying to them, why don't you talk to the religious folks in Guatemala? The Catholic Bishop of Belize engaging the Archbishop of Guatemala.
Yeah.
Do you think that would be a practical approach, and is something, that type of approach, perhaps,
Absolutely.
Would that be workable?
It'd be certainly worth a try. I mean, very, very important. Any type of conversation, face to face, where you see human beings face to face, and they have time, especially over good food. Very important. Very important.
By the way, that's exactly. I have a list of things that I tend to have to, but the first thing we do to start a dialogue,
Absolutely.
face to face over food.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the universal.
Well, and a wine too, I think, is good in my tradition.
Great
I'd like
use-
very
great
much
use
to
of mine.
thank Janice, Randall, Bob for a wonderful panel. Thank you very much. And I'll call Phil back up.